have, right now we have Representative Carlin is online with us. We know that we have some others that will be jumping online. Representative Hoffman is in another joint committee. So we've got, it's that time of the year where we've got people kind of jumping in and out. But we are going to go ahead and get started. I thought that we would, if we could just have our center table, please introduce yourselves, because I know for some of you, they might be new as far as working with them. So Meredith, we'll just go ahead and start with you. How about that?
Hi, I'm Meredith Fry, Research Analyst, Kansas Legislative Research Department.
Lindsay Archer, Kansas Legislative Research Department.
Shirley Morrow, Kansas Legislative Research Department.
Dusty Ralston, Broadcast Services.
I'm Natalie Scott. I work in the Office of Reviser of Statutes.
And Jason Thompson, Office of Reviser of Statutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Connie is serving as our committee assistant. She stepped out. So the travel voucher forms that we'll be filling out, those will be passed out tomorrow for the 3 days. So committee, we are going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start. Jason Thompson is going to give us an overview, just a reminder on our Open Meetings Act, but also we will follow that up with the duties and the functions by statute of this particular committee.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning, committee. So very briefly, you should have a memo somewhere in your digital files there from our office about the Open Meetings Act and the Open Records Act. I won't read all of that to you. Hopefully, for most of you, it's a refresher, which is the idea here. The Open Meetings Act, of course, applies to all meetings for the conduct of affairs by legislative and administrative bodies and agencies of the state. You, of course, as a legislative body, are subject to the Open Meetings Act. The elements of the meeting are kind of in there as a reminder to you, and there's really 3 parts to that. It's a gathering or assembly held in person or through the use of a telephone or any other medium for interactive communication. So that's the interactive communication portion. 2, a majority of the membership of a public body or agency that's subject to COMA, so a majority of you engaging in interactive communication. And thirdly, for the purpose of discussing the business or affairs of the public body or agency. So it's got to be about business or affairs of this body. The meeting subject to COMA can take many different forms, of course. You might have an informal gathering where suddenly a few of you that would constitute a majority of this committee suddenly start talking about something that seems to be the business before this committee, and at that point you probably should realize you're about to have an open meetings violation and you should stop. But most of the time there won't be a majority of you, and you can have these informal discussions, and you can discuss matters that are not the business of the committee. So you can discuss lunch, or you can discuss, your plans for the weekend and that sort of thing. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we're here gathering in the building for the next couple of days, and really anytime when you're serving in the legislature. I would point out the majority of the members for this committee is 8. There are 14 on the body, so a majority of you is 8. So if there's 7 of you or less, you can talk about the business of the committee as much as you want. I would caution, don't create a serial meeting though. Don't then have those 7 go off and talk to the rest of the body and start having an interactive communication that could be considered a serial communication or a serial meeting. So I always throw that in there as well. That's one way that we've seen open meeting violations happen. So I always want to give that red flag. And then the next piece of the memo is about closed or executive meetings. This body doesn't really do closed or executive meetings very often. If you do have a statutory ability to do that for some topic that you're covering, there's a special motion that our office will help the chairperson write. That has to be made and put in the record, and there are very specific statutory requirements to close this meeting and to have an executive session. Then briefly, I'll just hit the Open Records Act. It's less likely to be an issue for a committee. Most of these issues are handled by our office, Research and Legislative Administrative Services, right? Because we're the ones who maintain the records that most of you would think of as legislative records. All the records that are public are open for inspection to any person. That's why we post these items online, make them available to everyone, tell them to contact Research or the revisor if they'd like copies of them, et cetera. So that's most of what your records issues would be. And of course, if you have any questions about COMA or CORA, our office is happy to help. And hopefully that will give you a little refresher and remind you to be on your toes when you're thinking about COMA and CORA. So I'll stand for any questions if you have them.
Be on your toes, but no pirouettes, please. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, let's go ahead and move on to our duties and our functions.
Okay, thank you again, Madam Chair. And for this one, you have in your packet, you just have a copy of KSA 46-2801 that has a little box at the top that says our office prepared this on November 28th. And all I did was highlight a couple of specific provisions, and I'll mention those, why they're highlighted as we get to them.
Yes, Senator Dahl.
For us old people like me, illiterate when it comes to computers, other things, how do I find this? I'm on the joint committee on corrections, juvenile justice oversight. Feel I can't find.
Okay, you should see agendas and minutes. If you, so you're looking at the committee page, and it says in bold, meeting day on call, and right under that is agendas and minutes. And if you click on agendas and minutes, so you have a PDF for our agenda, and absolutely all of the testimony is in there, and for today? Okay, we're still getting some for today. But the COMA and CORA is all there. Are you finding? Okay. Nope, no problem. Any other questions? Representative Smith, are you able to find also? Okay. All right, now we'll move forward. Thank you.
Great. Good to get that covered too. That's another good refresher how we find all of this stuff, because it's been a while for everyone. I had to do the same thing about an hour ago. So, all right, so your duties and functions defined by KSA 46-2801. This is a joint committee. It's a statutory committee. So it tells how many representatives are on the committee, how many senators are on the committee, the party makeup, et cetera. So that's all covered in those early subsections. And then in subsection I, K, near the bottom of the page, you get into the powers and duties authorized by law or by the LCC. The joint committee shall do these things, and there's a list of several items. The first is monitor the inmate population and review and study the programs, activities, and plans of the Department of Corrections. So that's why you'll hear from the Department of Corrections so much. There are a number of items in there that you're supposed to hear about every year. Expansion projects, operations, food service, programming, community corrections, et cetera. So that's all in K1, and that's why you're doing that one every year. Number two there, that's highlighted, is monitor the establishment of the Juvenile Justice Authority and review and study the programs, activities, and plans of the Juvenile Justice Authority regarding the duties of JJA that are prescribed by statute, including several things. And obviously, we haven't amended this statute in a while because all of you know the Juvenile Justice Authority is no longer. That was rolled back into the Department of Corrections, and they have their own division that handles the juvenile issues. That was a little bit outdated. That's why I was highlighting that one for you. The chairperson asked to highlight some of those that are maybe have dated references or maybe are not as relevant as the others anymore. Not to say that juvenile issues are not relevant. Obviously, you'll be studying a number of them today, but the wording in the statute is kind of behind the times. Number 3 there is review and study the adult correctional programs and activities and facilities of counties, cities, and other local governmental entities. So occasionally you'll get into that. And every year you're supposed to be hearing about those programs and how they work along with your state programs. So that's one of your main charges. Number 4, review and study the juvenile offender programs and activities and facilities of counties, cities, school districts, and other local governmental entities. That's part of your oversight of the juvenile side. And again, you do that every year. Number 5, again, is highlighted, and partially because of the outdated reference here. Study the progress and results of the transition of powers, duties, and functions from the Kansas Department for Children and Families, Office of Judicial Administration, and Department of Corrections to the Juvenile Justice Authority. That might be kind of reversed now. You've been doing that over the last few years, right? The transition of powers, duties, and functions back to the Department of Corrections from the Juvenile Justice Authority and other related issues, but that's obviously an outdated reference. And then finally, number 6, you're making an annual report to the LCC as required by the LCC statute 46-1207. And you're allowed to make other special reports to the House and the Senate as deemed appropriate by your committee. And on occasion, you've done that. You've written in your report, or you've sent letters to the chairperson of a House or Senate committee to request hearings on specific matters, or to request a joint hearing to be conducted on, like, human trafficking, for example. And Meredith is going to cover a number of those requests that have happened over the last few years. But that's where those come from, is that K6. And I would point out, I kind of glossed over it at the beginning, you also have powers and duties authorized by the LCC. So when the chairperson made that request to the LCC for the number of days and the topics that were requested, and the LCC granted those, that triggered your authority to examine those issues as well. So you have that broader ability as well. So if there's a related issue you want to get into, that's why that letter process is so important, to get the LCC to authorize you to examine those issues. I think that's it for now. I highlighted a couple of the outdated ones, and obviously, there's only a few very specific items covered here. Some of them are sort of umbrella items, but I think the chairperson wanted you to maybe be thinking about other duties that might need to be outlined here, changes that might need to be made to a couple of the outdated ones. I think that was my purpose, so hopefully I got you on the right track.
You did a great job of that, Jason. Thank you. It kind of leads into what will be our next presentation. We'll not jump there quite yet, but we're going to look at what's been proposed in the past by this joint committee. But one of the things that I think is harmful is when we have made legislative changes and we're not going back to make sure that we keep things updated. And so, as you can tell, at least the items that Jason had highlighted here, those are the items that have been updated for a couple years now. And so now is the time for us to look at bringing those to date, but also, is there something from a broader standpoint that this committee is feeling should be addressed with regard to the authority of this joint committee? And again, you know, one of the disadvantages of a change that occurred, I believe it would have been like 6 years ago, but the Senate does not have any form of corrections or juvenile justice committee. So the only time that we will be looking at legislation that's specific to that is if it comes to the Judiciary Committee. Before that, there was actually a Juvenile Corrections Committee, but that was removed some time ago. And so we don't have that same balance of committees, House and Senate, similar to some of our other committees as well. So committee, are there any questions for Jason since he has gone over that? Seeing none, thank you so much. We will now move on to Meredith Fry. She's going to give us an overview, and actually you do have that packet before you, so that you can make some notations on it. It's the light purple color. And this is recommendations and proposed legislation for the last 5 years. So she's going to kind of give us an update because, you know, we have our committee, we make those recommendations. The recommendations, as well as the annual report, goes to the LCC. Then there is a pause. We start a legislative session, and away we go with bills that are and aren't introduced. So this is going to give us that look back to see really what have been the outcomes of this committee. So thank you, Meredith.
Good morning, Chairwoman and Committee. I'm Meredith Fry with Kansas Legislative Research Department. You will find a packet with a lavender cover on it at your desk. And this document has the committee's recommendation and proposed legislation for the last 5 years. That was a request that was made at our April organizational meeting. So it has the recommendations and proposed legislation for 2022, 2021, 2020, 2019, and 2018. So those recommendations and the proposed legislation are listed on the left column of this Excel sheet. And the right columns have the outcomes that came from those recommendations in the legislation. Please note that's not exhaustive, but a place to start when looking back in time. And if you have any questions, it's kind of a study guide for you to look at. And on the third day of this committee, you'll make recommendations and proposed legislation. So if you have any questions about any of these, let staff know, and we can help you find answers to that. But you'll see it's recommendations, and then it'll have proposed legislation, and then the other side, the outcome. But some of these can get kind of tricky with conference committees and whatnot, but we tried to explain it pretty simple, but we can go into more detail with legislative history if need be. And you'll also notice that, like, one of them says C. Clark and Anderson report. That's going to be presented on the third day. So some of these things if are coming up too.
Meredith, can you highlight some of those that have kind of appeared repeatedly for several years?
So I can note a few. I have only been on this committee. This is my second time in this committee. But there's definitely been offender registration, things that have come up multiple times. There's KDOC fiscal related items. There's several that are related to the study that Clark and Anderson will report on. And then there's bills that have been recommended by, like, the Sentencing Commission that have just kind of grouped and become a recommendation by this committee. Evidence-based programs account. There's numerous things.
Committee, I think if you look on page 2, you'll see a number of recommendations with regard to changes in policy. And you'll see the ones that either died in Senate Judiciary or died in the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee. We did have a couple that were stricken from the House calendar. So when we look at changes to the drug grid and the non-drug grid, making modifications to offender registries, even the compassionate release, you'll see that those are ones that historically we mention and that have not passed, either out of committee or they've gotten out of committee, but they've never gotten to the other house. The other thing that I think is important is look at some of the listed concerns, such as the cost of expungement, the concerns that were listed about funding, making changes, requests that were made of the Department of Corrections, like they conduct an outreach program, webinars, or campaigns for the evidence-based programs funds. Those are the kinds of things that when the secretary is here and when others are here testifying, that spend a little time on this, so that, one, we ask those questions when the individuals are here and testifying. But the other thing is, really, what is it that we are wanting as a committee, as a joint committee, to be serious about trying to push forward this upcoming legislative session? So it's one thing to meet and say, oh, let's do something about offender registration. Let's make sure that when we are meeting Wednesday afternoon, we've identified what is it about offender registration perhaps that we want to change? Or what is it with regard to expungement very specifically so that we can start that process and be serious about moving forward? And that we can perhaps make that determination that legislation needs to be introduced on both sides so that it can get up and out of each committee and cross over, as opposed to waiting to get something back, because you'll see so much. Just when you look on page 2 from this last year, where it died in the committee May 23rd, 2022. It died in the committee. It died in the House committee. It died in the Senate. That is just a grocery list of everything that didn't go further. And to me, I do feel that this very much ties into the obligations with regard to the law of what is the responsibility of this joint committee. So I do feel that a committee should be here for more than just, we're going to do a quick dip, which is a term that I learned my very first session serving on the Juvenile Justice Committee in the Senate, the quick dip, as far as giving juveniles that quick dip and that being impactful. But for us to come together for 3 days and make recommendations and to have them go nowhere. So part of what I believe we really do need to have some consideration to is what can we do as a joint committee to be more impactful when we are in legislative session? How can we be more impactful when our funding committees are meeting to make recommendations to them. Because all of us, once we get into regular session, are on the committees that we serve on. And for the Senate, it's just, several of the senators on this committee are not on Judiciary Committee. So how can we find a way to make it more impactful? So if you'll, this was kind of, it's one of those, the old school teacher, where you would have, as kids came in the classroom, there was a prompt on the board that they were supposed to kind of get started, and that was the springboard for the assignment or the lesson for that day. So this is kind of our springboard of what is it that we need to change with regard to what is the duties of this joint committee, but also what do we change to be more impactful? Because we are dealing throughout the state, and we spent a lot of time focusing on what's happening at the state level, state corrections facilities. But as you reviewed that definition of the responsibilities, it's also what's happening in the jail system, what's happening in our schools with regard to juveniles. And I was reminded, in fact, in Miami County, we're going to have a special meeting with the commissioners next week because we have so many folks that are now in the jail, not because they've committed a crime, but again, it's a mental health issue, and they're unable to transfer them anywhere. And our CMHC is unwilling to come and dispense medications to them. So we have, just in one small county in our state, they're at a breaking point with their county jail simply because most of the folks that are filling the beds there are mental health folks. They don't have the individuals available to dispense meds, and our community mental health center is not doing it either unless they get an increase in funding from the county. So I don't know that Miami County is necessarily that unique compared to other counties, but it is a part of our oversight. And so some of the speakers that we have coming through the course of these next 3 days are going to help us kind of just address what some of those issues are. So trying to broaden that scope, if you will. Any questions or comments about the pale violet packet? I think we just killed one little tree for this, but do spend a little time in that because, like I always ask of students, show your work. And we don't have a lot here that we can show as far as what's been outcome, direct outcome. Senator Faustido.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on the violet package here of legislation that we've recommended in the past, do you have one or two pieces that would warrant our attention?
Well, I think we're going to have a presentation, I believe it's tomorrow, with regard to the offender registration. And they're going to be bringing some data for us, very specific data. And I think that we need to be sure, they're coming to us with their expertise. And so if there are specific changes, we need to be able to glean from them, is it going to require legislative action, or can the changes that we're wanting them to make, are they able to do that with just direction from us? Would they be willing to do that? And if there's data that they haven't collected or aren't able to collect, then we need to also make that clear to them as far as in the future, this needs to be perhaps a little bit more value added. I know that we have spent time in the past talking about expungements and talked about, do you create a week or a day, or what is the process for folks to go through that? And I know that Representative Carlin has spoken about that quite a bit as well, and we know that it is successful in other states. So how do we do it so that it will be successful if we were truly to initiate that? So, those are just two examples of. Obviously, in the past, we've always been pretty concerned about, is the funding really flowing on evidence-based programs? Is that really getting out to the communities? Is there money still sitting around? And this is, quite frankly, where we have that Venn diagram overlap, because I know that the Child Welfare Oversight Committee was approached by, I believe it was the Boys and Girls Club, feeling that they would make a significant impact if they had some funding, and they were unaware of the evidence-based programs fund account and what that process was. Now, I was looking at some old notes from 2 years ago when we met in this joint committee, and we talked to the Department of Corrections at length about how they disperse those funds. And they do it where here's this deadline, and you either make the deadline or you miss the deadline. And we talked to them about perhaps some organizations have kind of a revolving, where they have 3 or 4 different points where organizations, communities can apply for funding. And so I look forward to hearing how that's working. I know we've continued to have several years of being concerned about more than $2 million that's sitting there and hasn't been utilized because of the KDAD's RFP process for a juvenile crisis facility. So we'll be looking at that as well. Other comments? Okay, let's move forward. Let's move on to, I think we're ready for the overview of Senate Bill 367. So we're going to start with Representative Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Did you have
Actually-
your PowerPoint?
No, actually, we're going to start with Natalie.
Okay.
And then I'll jump in there.
All right.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am going to go over a couple things. The first would be some of the juvenile justice reform legislation that you guys have passed, starting in 2016 with Senate Bill 367, and then a couple of the pieces of follow-up legislation. And then I am going to give you guys a brief overview of 2021 House Bill 2200, which was worked on by the House Corrections Committee last year. And so then I believe Representative Owens is going to talk to you some more about that legislation and the testimony that we heard. So starting off with Senate Bill 367 back in 2016, there was a pretty substantial piece of legislation passed that made a lot of reforms to the juvenile justice system here in Kansas. So I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights of that. The first big change was that a juvenile would be required to be delivered to their parents or guardians unless there is reason to believe that it wouldn't be in the best interest of that child or would pose a risk to public safety or property. And that meant that a juvenile wouldn't be able to be taken from their parents' custody unless a detention risk assessment would assess that juvenile as detention eligible, or there were grounds to otherwise override the results of that assessment. A juvenile wouldn't be able to be taken into custody for violation of a term of probation or other out-of-home placement. And to obtain a warrant to arrest a juvenile, a supervision officer would have to set forth that the juvenile violated a condition of disposition 3 or more times and that they pose a significant risk of physical harm to another or damage to property. Each director of juvenile justice intake and assessment services across the state was required to adopt a policy and establish guidelines for immediate intervention processes. That's what we think of as diversion in the adult system. And juveniles would be given a right to participate in an immediate intervention program. Cumulative detention of a juvenile was limited to a maximum of 45 days over the course of that juvenile's case. And juveniles would then be presumed to be juveniles. There were certain instances before Senate Bill 367 where juveniles were actually presumed to be adults and then would be treated under the adult system. That new presumption can only be rebutted by a preponderance of the evidence, and a juvenile would have to be at least 14 to be prosecuted as an adult. Extended jurisdiction juvenile prosecution, which you probably have heard referred to as EJJP, can only be used for juveniles that are charged with an off-grid or non-drug severity level 1 through 4 person felony. The Department of Corrections, working with the Supreme Court, was required to adopt a statewide system of structured community-based graduated responses for technical violations of probation and other violations of conditional release or disposition. They were also required to develop standards to guide those immediate intervention programs that are used throughout the state. The bill also put probation length limits for juvenile offenders, so low and moderate risk offenders who are adjudicated for misdemeanors and low risk offenders who are adjudicated for felonies can be placed on probation for up to 6 months. High risk offenders that are adjudicated for misdemeanors and moderate risk offenders adjudicated for felonies can be placed on probation for up to 9 months. And then high risk offenders adjudicated for a felony can be placed on probation for up to 12 months. Those probation length limits don't apply to juveniles who are adjudicated for off-grid felonies, rape, aggravated sodomy, or murder in the second degree. The court can extend those probation limits if the juvenile needs time to complete an evidence-based program while they're on probation. Overall case length limits were also imposed. Juveniles adjudicated for a misdemeanor can remain under the court jurisdiction for up to 12 months. Low and moderate risk offenders adjudicated for felonies can remain under jurisdiction for 15 months. And high-risk offenders adjudicated for felonies can remain under jurisdiction for up to 18 months. Again, those overall case length limits don't apply to juveniles who are adjudicated for off-grid or non-drug severity level 1 through 4 felonies. Supervision levels were required to be based on the results of a risk and need assessment that was given to the juvenile. A risk and needs assessment was required now to be conducted before sentencing could take place. And then placement of a juvenile offender in the custody of the Secretary of Corrections would only be able to happen when a juvenile poses a significant risk of harm to another or damage to property and is otherwise eligible. Juveniles adjudicated for certain sex offenses can be placed in short-term alternative placement in an emergency shelter, a therapeutic foster home, or community integration programs if it's deemed that they can't remain in their in-home placement. Sentence maximums and certain scores needed for placement on the risk and needs assessment were created. So this would be kind of like the sentencing grid for adults, but it's a little bit more malleable. Serious offender 1 category offenders can be placed for a minimum of 18 months and a maximum of 36 months. Serious offender 2s can be placed a minimum of 9 months, maximum of 18 months. Serious offender 3s can be placed for a minimum of 6 months and a maximum of 12 months if they are assessed as high risk. And then serious offender 4s can be placed for a minimum of 6 months and a maximum of 12 months, again, if they're assessed as high risk. Chronic offender 1s can be placed for a minimum term of 6 months and a maximum of 12 months if they're assessed high risk. And then there's a rebuttable presumption that all those offenders in the chronic offender category between the ages of 10 and 14 in the serious offender 2, 3, and 4 categories would be placed in youth residential facility instead of at the juvenile correctional facility. Starting back in January of 2018, the Secretary of Corrections was limited on how many youth residential facility beds they were able to contract for. That limit was put at 50 non-foster care beds in those youth residential facilities. A juvenile cannot be ordered to return to a juvenile correctional facility for a violation of their condition of release, and then they have to be discharged from that juvenile correctional facility once the overall case length limit is met. The Department of Corrections and the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, which was created as a part of Senate Bill 367, were tasked with exploring methods for exchanging confidential data between the different parts of the juvenile justice system. And the Kansas Juvenile Justice Improvement Fund was created. The Secretary of Corrections was required to certify the cost savings from the reduction in the out-of-home placements that would have been brought about by Senate Bill 367, and then they were supposed to transfer that cost savings into this newly created fund. The purpose of that fund was to use it for evidence-based programming so that those kids were staying in their communities, staying in their in-home placements, but there would be programming for them to attend. And prioritization of that money was to be given to regions that were demonstrating a high rate of out-of-home placement of juvenile offenders before Senate Bill 367 took place. So that was kind of a general overview of a lot of the changes that were made in Senate Bill 367. The next year, in 2017, you all passed Senate Bill 42, which was kind of considered a trailer bill. Some technical fixes to the legislation were fixed, but there were a few policy changes. So that bill required that a judge must consider and make certain findings when they remove a juvenile from the home for the first time. And the reason that was done was to maintain eligibility for 4E funding from the federal government. That bill also removed the requirement for the Secretary for Children and Families to prepare parents for a juvenile's return if that juvenile was in an out-of-home placement at the time of sentencing. So essentially, if they weren't going to be going back into the home, it removed that requirement for DCF. Supervision officers were also given the ability to request a warrant for a juvenile who absconded from supervision, and it allowed the court to issue that warrant and extend or modify the terms of probation when that juvenile has absconded. Probation length limits were also told during that time if the juvenile was not showing up to their appointments and absconding from supervision. Juveniles charged with sex offenses are not required to be offered participation in an immediate intervention program. Under the original bill, they would have been required to be offered that. Immediate intervention is also not required for juveniles who were originally charged with a felony, but then that charge was later amended down to be a misdemeanor. Upon a finding by the trier of fact that a firearm was used in the commission of a felony, then the judge would be able to commit that juvenile to a juvenile correctional facility for a maximum of 18 months, regardless of the results of that risk and needs assessment. The Juvenile Justice Improvement Fund was also transformed into the evidence-based programs account, which is what you know it as today. And the secretary was also given authority to certify that cost savings that was to be transferred into that fund multiple times a year instead of just doing that one time a year and transferring a large amount of money at one time. So then in 2018, you guys passed Senate Bill 179, and that bill created the Juvenile Crisis Intervention Centers. Those were intended to provide short-term observation, assessment, and treatment and case planning for juveniles who are experiencing mental health crises. Those juveniles would no longer be able to be put in detention facilities or the juvenile correctional facility under Senate Bill 367. So these centers were created for that purpose. A juvenile can be admitted for not more than 30 days when the head of the center determines that the juvenile is in need of treatment, and a qualified mental health professional from a community mental health center has given written authorization for the admission of that juvenile. A parent or legal guardian can remove a child from those crisis intervention centers at any time. A law enforcement officer can take a child into custody when the officer reasonably believes that the child is experiencing a mental health crisis and is likely to cause harm to themselves or to others, and then they can deliver that child to a juvenile crisis intervention center. When a court determines an order or a temporary order of protective custody is needed, the court can place that child into a juvenile crisis intervention center. if a juvenile is taken into law enforcement custody pursuant to the Juvenile Offender Code and they're determined to be not detention eligible, then they can be taken to the Juvenile Crisis Intervention Center. The evidence-based programs account that you guys created in Senate Bill 367 was also expanded to include services for these juveniles. And it could be used for the purpose of opening those juvenile crisis intervention centers. So that is where we left that. That's the last kind of big piece of juvenile justice reform legislation that you all have passed. So I'll stop there maybe and take questions with any of that.
Okay, so we're going to start with Representative Owens, and then we're going to go to Senator Foscato.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Natalie, do you know if we have any of these juvenile crisis intervention centers currently?
Not to my knowledge, but I could stand corrected on that. I'm not aware of any that are operating at the moment.
Same, thank you.
Senator Foscato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie, for those juveniles that are placed in their homes, if they violate that right, so are they automatically removed, or does it have to be a court proceeding to replace them?
Are you talking about juveniles who are adjudicated as offenders under the Juvenile Justice Code? Okay, so if a juvenile is in their own home, they're not an out-of-home placement, and they're just on probation or something like that, then there is a set of required kind of community responses to technical violations of probation. So that was one of the things that Senate Bill 367 put in place. You can't just revoke a juvenile's probation and send them straight to the juvenile correctional facility. So they're not listed in statute, but they're in court rule and Department of Corrections policies. So there's a set of kind of graduated responses. So no, they are not removed from their home at that time. It could get to the point where they could be placed in detention if they were assessed and they met the criteria for detention eligibility, or if that was overridden for some reason. But no, essentially they're not taken from their homes in those circumstances.
Madam Chair, Natalie, but if they were, it would have to go through a court proceeding to sentence them
Yes.
again? Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Committee, other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much, Natalie. Your report still hasn't been populated on the list, though it was uploaded at the start of the meeting, so it's in there. It's not appearing yet.
And that actually was just the first half. That brings me to what happened in 2021.
Okay.
So I will,
Thank you.
so you have another portion from me. House Bill 2200 was introduced at that time, and that bill would, it hasn't been passed by you all yet. It did make it through the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee, so I'll talk about how that bill was introduced and the changes that committee made. So that bill would allow the evidence-based programs account money to be used on more juveniles. It would also require the Department of Corrections to build data systems and allow the juvenile overall case length limits to be extended in certain circumstances. So Section 1 of that bill enacts a new section to require that the Secretary of Corrections and the Secretary for Children and Families enter into an MOU to coordinate administering a risk and needs assessment to children who have been identified as exhibiting behavior that could lead to offending behavior during the course of a child in need of care proceeding. That MOU would include procedures for allowing those identified children to participate in evidence-based programs that are offered by the Department of Corrections. So these juveniles are not juvenile offenders yet, but maybe they're exhibiting behavior that lead people to think that they, could eventually become juvenile offenders if no intervention is taken, so they could participate in that programming to try to stop that behavior. A copy of that MOU would be required to be provided to this committee, the Senate Standing Committee on Judiciary, and the House Standing Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice. Section 2 would amend KSA 382203. That's the jurisdiction statute in the SYNC code. That statute is amended to provide that if a juvenile is eligible to receive services from DCF or the Department of Corrections or the judicial branch, those agencies would collaborate together to provide those services. And nothing in the subsection would preclude the child from accessing services provided by DCF or DOC or the judicial branch if they're otherwise eligible. Section 3 does the same thing in the jurisdiction statute for the juvenile justice code. Section 4 amends KSA 382361, and this is a change that was added by the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee on their work. That statute provides the sentencing alternatives for juveniles who are adjudicated as juvenile offenders. Under current law there, when a juvenile is committed to detention, that cumulative detention over the course of their case can exceed 45 days. That was something that was put in place in Senate Bill 367. This bill would change that cumulative detention cap to 90 days over the course of the juvenile's case. Section 5 amends KSA 382391. That's the statute that provides the overall case length limits. And that statute was amended to provide that the court can extend the overall case length limits for the completion of an evidence-based program when the failure to complete that program was because of the juvenile. So if they kind of stopped going or something, then that overall case length limit can be told while they're not participating in it, and it can be extended so that they can finish that program. Section 6 amends KSA 382392. These are more changes that were added by the House Corrections Committee in their work. The changes made in that section would provide that when a juvenile is placed on probation, a judge can commit the juvenile to detention for a probation violation, and that would include a technical violation or contempt of court. The length of that time would be 24 hours in detention for a first violation, 48 hours for a second violation, and 15 days on a third or subsequent violation. Section 7 amends KSA 7552-162. That's the statute that requires the Department of Corrections and the Kansas Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee to explore those methods of exchanging confidential data. This statute is amended to require that the Department of Corrections develop a system to facilitate exchanging that confidential data. It would, under the bill as written right now, it would have to occur before July 1 of 2024. And the department would be required to report to this committee, the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senate Ways and Means, and the House Corrections Committee on the progress of developing that system. Section 8 amends KSA 7552-164. That's the statute that creates the evidence-based programs account in the State General Fund. Current law there allows that fund to be used for evidence-based community programs for juvenile offenders or those 179 juveniles, so juveniles who are experiencing mental health crisis. This bill would expand that to include the children that are administered a risk and needs assessment and identified or are identified as needing services under Section 1. So those children that would who are likely to offend or exhibiting behavior that would lead people to think they may become juvenile offenders. These programs right now are able to be administered by community supervision officers, and so that includes juvenile intake and assessment, court services, community corrections, and those juvenile crisis intervention centers. And this bill would expand the people who can provide that programming to include community mental health centers and other community-based service providers who offer those evidence-based community programs. Subsection E there would require the Secretary of Corrections to develop and implement a grant program with the goal of implementing those evidence-based community programs throughout the state. And then the Secretary would be required to put in place procedures for adopting those grants and providing that grant money. The Secretary would evaluate those evidence-based programs to receive that grant to make sure that the program is being delivered as it was designed to. And then subsection F requires expenditures from this evidence-based programs account to be made promptly and on a rolling basis to get those community programs developed. And so I can take any questions you guys have on what that bill would do.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie, Section 5, could you repeat that for me a little bit, or slow down with her, or,
Oh, sure.
yeah.
So Section 5 amends KSA 382391. And what that section does right now is provide overall case length limits for a juvenile offender. So if a juvenile commits an offense, there's a set amount of time. Say it's one of the juveniles who can be under court jurisdiction for 15 months. So, they're going on with their case, they're being adjudicated, they're on probation, maybe they've messed up on probation a few times. But once 15 months have passed, then the court can no longer have jurisdiction over that offender. They say, this case has been terminated. And so what the change here would do would be to allow a judge to extend that overall case length limit if a juvenile is still participating in an evidence-based program. And the reason they're not done with that program yet is because of a delay on the juvenile. So say the juvenile absconds and can't find him for 4 months, and so he's not in his programming. And then we get to that 15-month overall case length limit. Well, under current law, they would be required to be discharged. But this bill would say, okay, juvenile, you ran away for 4 months, so we're going to extend your overall case length limit and allow you to finish this programming.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Help me explain, or help me understand, what, it talks about adult in that Section 5 there. What does that have to do with, that last sentence or so? It says something by an adult.
By an
It's,
adult.
no, it
I would
says,
have
note, under the continuing law, there's no limit on cumulative detention for juvenile offenders for a felony which is committed by an adult, though it would constitute an off-grid.
So all that is saying is if their offense is such that if it had been committed by an adult, we would consider it this high-level offense.
It's not like if a juvenile becomes an adult
No.
during that. Okay,
No.
thank you.
That's just how we refer to, because we don't have a separate set of crimes for juveniles. So in the juvenile code, we refer to these crimes as, if you were an adult, it would be a severity level 1 offense over here. Yeah.
Committee, other questions? Senator Foscato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie, a follow-up on Senator Dahl's question. So if they are discharged from the program under current law, so what, do they just automatically, if they are apprehended again, go to jail?
No. So the overall case length limit basically acts as kind of a complete end time for when the court can have any involvement with this juvenile for that particular crime. So once that 15 months has passed, the court can't do anything else. If the juvenile is in detention, they have to be let out. If they're in the juvenile correctional facility, they have to be let out. If they're on probation, their probation is over. So it acts as, the overall length of time that juvenile can be under any kind of court jurisdiction for that offense. Now, if they commit a new offense, then they will have a new overall case length limit for that offense.
And you, and Madam Chair, if I could ask Natalie, for those evidence-based programs with Senate Bill 367, where would one apply? Do they apply locally or to the Secretary of State's office?
So the idea of those evidence-based programs is that they are provided throughout the state to juveniles who need that. So there would be some here in Shawnee County, some in Sedgwick County, some in Douglas County. You would have to ask the Department of Corrections where, and court services, where they're currently being offered. But the idea is that they can be offered, the juvenile can stay in their home and receive that evidence-based programming wherever they live throughout the state.
Sure. Thank you. I'll ask Randy.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie, help me remember, when we were talking about that 15-month window, did that include absconding time or not?
So that's one of so in Senate Bill 367, you had probation length limits and you had overall case length limits, and they couldn't be extended for any purpose. So once you guys did Senate Bill 42, you allowed the probation length limit to be extended and told when the offender is absconding from supervision. So that probation length limit was told, but the overall case length limit was not told. So when you think of those limits, you have the probation limit might be 6 months, but the overall case length limit might be 15 months. So if they're messing up on probation, you still have some time to allow them to complete that community-based programming. But under those pieces of legislation, the overall case length limit wasn't told at all. So under House Bill 2200, the overall case length limit would be able to be extended, but only for the purpose of allowing those juveniles to complete evidence-based programming. So if they abscond from supervision and part of what happens while they're absconding is that they're falling behind on their programming, then it would be able to be extended, but not necessarily because they were absconding, but because they need more time to complete that programming.
And I guess that's what I kind of remember as the discussion really centered around the idea of the exploitation by the juvenile of the tolling time, right? And so then being able to avoid programming, those programs that we have in place, just simply by not participating.
Representative Heiberger, you don't have a question? Okay. Natalie, could you talk to us a little bit on Section 6? What was the basis for this? What type of research or are other states doing that? Give us a little bit of background on Section 6.
So that section, and I think this will overlap a little bit maybe with what Representative Owens is going to talk about, but we received the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee during the hearing on House Bill 2200, received testimony from a judge in Sedgwick County, and he had some modifications that he wanted made to the underlying Senate Bill 367 based on some experiences in his courtroom. And so I think that Representative Owens will maybe talk about the reasoning that they decided to make those changes. This was based on that judge's recommendation and the testimony that he received.
Okay. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry for this hasn't been passed yet.
Right.
How far did it get? I mean, where did it go?
It got out of the House Committee on Corrections, and then it was not debated on the floor.
Okay.
So it was introduced in the House, made it through the Corrections Committee, and then it died. I'll let Representative Owens kind of talk about maybe what he thinks happened there.
Committee, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much, Natalie. And now we will go to Representative Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie always does such a great job explaining all this and helping me refresh my memory as we dive back into this legislation. So before I address some of the questions specifically that were asked, I would note that on page 1 of the, the purple sheets here from our recommendations in 2022, or 2021, this was a recommendation for 2022, was the proposed House Bill 2200. So that's part of what drew our attention to it in the House Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice. So just so everybody knows, the basis for this legislation was a recommendation previously of this committee. So primarily what this legislation would do is a couple of things, as mentioned by Natalie, but I just want to maybe lay them out a little bit more in layman terms. We have youth that currently under the system and under current law cannot access any of the funds or any of the treatment because they're not technically in the system yet. They haven't been charged with a crime. They haven't actually been brought into the system. But we know that they're on a trajectory to move into the system if we don't intervene earlier. So one of the primary goals of this legislation was to make those funds and those evidence-based programs available to youth before they catch a case and before they're specifically in the system. So it opens that up tremendously. On top of that, we have those additional sanctions and those additional pieces in here. That what we've heard over the last couple of years from various stakeholders is that while SB 367 in whole has been very good and very beneficial for the vast majority of the youth, there is this section of offender that quite literally makes a mockery of the system. And we heard from Commissioner Jim Howell of Sedgwick County, who came and testified on this piece of legislation. And we heard on behalf from him and from a number of others that I'll touch on here momentarily about this subset of youth that realizes that there are these time limits, and so they can push the system. No matter what they do, they can't get in any more trouble. They can't do any time. They can't go to juvenile detention. There are no additional sanctions. And so quite literally, they would come into the court system and make a mockery of it, knowing that the judge's hands were tied. So we've heard that. If you will, and anybody can look this up, ks.legislature.org, and search for House Bill 2200, you will be able to pull up all of the testimony that I'm going to reference while I mention this. But specific testimony from the Sedgwick County Commissioner during a roundtable discussion with with Sedgwick County Juvenile Justice Authority and many other stakeholders, had several conclusions from that discussion, and a lot of those were built into this legislation. One was to remove or allow extension of juvenile case and probation length limits, which we've addressed. Remove or increase juvenile detention limits, which we have addressed. Allow juvenile judges the discretion to change jurisdiction over an offender even following an adult conviction. So that wasn't specifically addressed in here, but it's certainly a worthy topic of conversation. And then create an out-of-home placement option for high-risk juvenile offenders. We didn't have that one either. And then some immediate punishment or sanctions for juveniles found in contempt of court, which is part of this legislation. So we heard from Sedgwick County in support of this legislation. We also heard from the Behavioral Health Association of Kansas that spoke specifically as a proponent on this legislation, really specifically to two pieces, and that was the substance use disorder treatment is at the root of a substantial portion of behavioral health problems. The adults, addictions may be clear and obvious, but inadequate funding for SUD services means they are untreated, and youth suffer with the risk of further perpetration into the costly public system. So adding the funding for family treatment, which was part of this, would help as well. And then expanding of the community-based treatment providers to any other community-based service provider offering evidence-based community programs. So currently, there are some restrictions that say only certain organizations can access this funding for community-based or evidence-based systems, and this expands that to any other community-based provider. We also heard in support of this the Association of Community Mental Health of Kansas. They spoke as a proponent, and they also support the expansion really of the resources being available. Because if you guys will recall last year during this meeting, we talked a lot about those funds and how many of those funds were sitting there. They were actually sitting there to the extent that at one point they were swept out of the governor swept about half of those funds, $22 million if I recall, and utilized it in another area of the budget. Last year's budget, we were able to put that money back in there, but we were just realizing that those funds weren't being used. They just weren't getting to where they need to be. So this expands those use, and then also creates a mechanism to ensure that they are then utilized. And then the final was the Children's Alliance of Kansas was also supportive. So there's really a lot of support around this legislation. Certainly some opposition from a few organizations that didn't want to reintroduce sanctions or punishments back to juvenile offenders. So I'm certainly not going to say that it was not without its own opposition, but we heard and continue to hear time and time again that there are a subset of youth that, one, need intervention earlier before they catch a case and before they become part of the system, and then two, those that are in the system that have had every option thrown at them, and not only are they making a mockery of the system, they know that after 15 months their case is over no matter what they do. And so this legislation attempts to fix that. So I'm happy to discuss any specific item further or add any context on any of the specific items.
Okay, well, we'll start with Representative Heiberger, and then we'll go to Senator Falscadeau.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I think some of the opposition to what was proposed in that bill came from the fact that it was based on anecdotal evidence rather than any research. And I think that's still the case as far as I understand. But
Senator Falscadeau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator or Representative Owens, is this particular piece of legislation on the Sedgwick County legislative agenda? You mentioned County Commissioner Jim Howell.
That's a great question, and I will have to see. I know I was provided with a copy of that, a couple weeks ago at a meeting. I'm not I honestly, I can't remember.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Other questions, committee? I think if I fully understand, and I've not pulled up House Bill 2200, but the base of it addressed the issue of disbursement of funds, how to get that money. So really from a legislative standpoint, agencies, you've had time to make this work, you haven't made it work, so we're going to help nudge you through law to start making it work. And I think that's important. I guess I'm a little concerned about, I think those of us that have served in the legislature for a period of time, those that have served in law enforcement, would be able to pinpoint, a judge or two that you know what's going to happen if a case goes to that judge. You may support it, you may not support it, but judges have a reputation. And so I think what I heard you say, that there was a judge and he gleaned from what was before his bench, these were issues and changes he would like to see. Is that correct?
Not directly. So the judge you're referring to didn't even testify on this legislation. He was part of the roundtable discussion that reached these conclusions, and then Commissioner Jim Howell was the one that presented the recommendations of the Sedgwick County roundtable discussion for consideration.
Okay, but we've not heard from other counties, is that correct?
Not specifically on these. There was no other counties that spoke.
Okay.
As
I am a
proponent
little
or opponent.
leery in giving a judge jurisdiction beyond juvenile to should adult penalties occur. Just as I am a little concerned about a judge can commit a juvenile to detention for a probation violation, including a technical violation, because I think in the years that I've served on this committee, we've heard some pretty interesting technical violations. I heard a technical violation a couple weeks ago, which took a juvenile into custody and into foster care. He had a pack of cigarettes on him. A pack of cigarettes. In my communities, when a minor has a pack of cigarettes, they don't go after the minor. They go after, where did the minor get the cigarettes? Was it from parents, or did they buy them at the convenience store that just happened to be a block away from the high school? So do I want to see a kid go into juvenile detention because they had, when the judge said, let's see what's going on with him, he's got a pack of cigarettes on him? No. I want to see that it's something, I want to see a clear-cut definition of why we would expand judicial authority. And I also want to see somewhere along the way that other states have found that to be effective or more effective. I'm not seeing that, but then I can say, quite honestly, we've had no hearing on this legislation on the Senate side. So I really see we're looking at two very different things. One is that funding and the supports, and the other is what I would term as giving a stick, a very different stick to the judicial area. For those of you in the House that were part of these hearings, is that kind of, I'm seeing nods of head. It's two different things, isn't it? It's the carrot and helping add more carrots for communities, making sure that money gets out there. I mean, there's just absolutely, I think, nothing worse than we have a problem, we have available funding, the funding doesn't get to the folks that need it to help resolve issues in communities. I mean, that's two strikes, not one strike. But talk to me about, so we do have carrot through the process, but we've got a bigger stick or a different stick for the judicial branch, not any other group, is that correct?
Right, yeah, it would be within the judicial branch's authority to, for example, extend that case length limit if the juvenile is chosen, again, delay by the juvenile of not completing the evidence-based program. So yes, there's no doubt this is a encouragement of the use of the funding and broadening that, but it's also taking into consideration that look, there are extenuating circumstances with some juveniles who need additional repercussions for their actions within the system that is not being provided. And it is something that we have heard in this committee in the past 2 and 3 years ago, where we have had different organizations come in and speak about this. There just hasn't been the desire to move anything forward at that point.
Okay. I think the other thing, do we know, has anyone ever presented, did the roundtable address that overlap of kids that are also placed in foster care?
Well, I know that is part of what this addresses, is it adds the additional resources for the kids that are, and I'd have to look back at the section, child in need of care kids that may not be in the juvenile justice system yet, but could be heading that way. So this does address that partly as well.
Okay, share with me how it addresses that. Does it make funding available?
Give me just 1 second here to find that specific section. And Natalie, if you have that specific section, you're certainly welcome to help point me to that direction.
So the underlying bill, and it's not really just the one section, the section that expands, I suppose the evidence-based program account is the biggest one, but that underlying bill, the whole purpose of that bill is to expand the use of that money. So section 1 is going to allow those, you said foster children, but any child who is part of the child in need of care system to be administered that risk and needs assessment that's used for juvenile offenders to see if maybe there is some risk of them offending. And then if that assessment comes to bear, then that money would be able to be used on those juveniles.
Okay. It's a little clear to me, but I will simply share with this committee, and I believe that my colleague, Senator Faust-Cadeau, could back us up on that. I mean, we have data now. We have data of what isn't happening in foster care and isn't happening with the 4 contractors in foster care. And that data is because of the class action lawsuit that we settled as a state. So they collected the data for the first year, and it showed a significant number of kids, and that's why I posed the issue of foster care, because some of what you're talking about is kids on the run. And that continues to be an issue, a terrible issue in foster care. But we have data that shows that more than 50% of the kids going into foster care do not receive that initial assessment for mental health needs and behavioral health needs. I think that's really kind of what we're talking about here. They are not receiving that, as is stipulated in the multi-million dollar contracts with each of these groups. They're not doing their job. And yet we have kids, we spent an entire day until I think it was 7:30 in the evening, about 4 kids that were in foster care. They'd been in foster care for more than 3 years. And for more than 2 years, there were homes for them to be adopted, but the contractor and DCF didn't make a recommendation to let them be adopted. So how does this involve us? That's money going to them, services aren't being rendered, and kids that shouldn't still be in foster care, could have been adopted, weren't. But we know because of that court-mandated order, we know that those kids are not receiving the initial assessment. So if a kid's in foster care for 3 months, still hasn't received mental health assessment or behavioral health assessment, that also means they sure as heck aren't receiving any services for the issues that they may have, be them mental health and or behavioral health. So I did notice some language in there where we're talking about DCF. And at this point, part of my concern about that is what has been a sticking point. The same Secretary of DCF is the Secretary of KDADS, and that's why we still don't have an agreement, and we haven't released any of those funds for the crisis centers. That has been sitting there for 4 years now. Same secretary. Hasn't happened, and the money is just sitting there. It's not like the problems have gotten easier or lessened for tweens and teens. So I'm a little concerned about just how we let that free it up, because what I don't want is more money going to foster care contractors who we already know aren't doing their jobs, aren't getting the kids that are in this system, not criminal system, but in this system, get the services that they need. So I'm glad we've had this overview. I think that as we move forward, and on Wednesday when we make recommendations, I think there are certain things in House Bill 2200 that we want to really button down and we want to tighten up, because again, if a kid needs help, we're to make sure that the community has the resources to provide that help. It helps everyone around, and sometimes it needs to be the family as well. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I couldn't agree more with you the last 4 years, but I've been here a little longer than that, and I think DCF's been a problem way before the last 4 years. I think this has been ongoing since I've been here, since 12.
I would absolutely agree with you. The only thing that changed was the availability of that money for the centers. And I think all of us thought that first year that money was going to be there, we were going to open up a center. Guess what? The next year the money was going to be there. We'd open another center, because we even talked about this notion of let's get the centers funded, because as soon as they're built or retrofitted or established, they're going to be full and we're going to be needing the next one in line. So I would agree. I was just talking about when we merge the two agencies to work together in dispersing, it just seemed like the red tape got larger. But no, caring for our children, our vulnerable children in the state has been an ongoing issue, Yes, Senator Foscato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess of what I'm hearing is the concern that the children who are in foster care aren't being cared for, and then to be punished in the juvenile system with somewhat of the legislation that Representative Owens spoke of in that measure. I definitely would want to fix that so that they aren't hurt in both areas. So, and with that, if you could, Representative Owens, clarify or explain the piece in there. I believe you said families would get services. What does that look like, the entire family piece?
Well, that was one of the recommendations out of Sedgwick County, if I remember correctly. And I don't know that it was specifically addressed, although as part of, and Natalie is giving me the eye like she has the answer, so I will yield my time to her.
Madam Chair. I just wanted him to know I could. So one of the things that House Bill 2200 does is change the jurisdiction statute for both the Juvenile Offender Code and the Child in Need of Care Code. And the changes made there essentially say, if you're a juvenile offender and you have some overlap with the Child in Need of Care Code, or you're just a child in need of care, but you seem to be exhibiting this behavior, those agencies need to work together to provide you the services that you need. So the goal is, it doesn't really matter which system you're coming from. If you're a child in need of care and you're highlighted as needing services for juvenile offending behavior, then whether you get those services from DCF or from court services or from the Department of Corrections, the goal is you're going to get those services regardless of the system that you're coming from.
Other comments? Representative Owens.
Yeah, just a final thought on this, as we've had a good discussion about it. I truly agree that the key has got to be getting these kids the services that they need. And I know that we as legislators continue to do everything in our power to make that happen. But it appears we need the ability to take a stick to the state agencies. Just throwing that out there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
My preference is a 2x4. Who's next? Yes, Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was reviewing the testimony, as I was not a member of this committee in the previous session, from the commissioner from Sedgwick, and it looks like some of the suggestions were taken up in HB, 2200, and also in the testimony it was mentioned about limiting the use of the prone position as well as wrap restraints. And I want to say that committee did hear something on that, but was that in a separate bill? Could I get a slight update on that, since this was brought up as part of HB 2200 testimony?
Representative Owens.
Yeah, so there was a piece of legislation that was introduced in my committee, and if I remember correctly, it may even be on this list. Long story short, I recall what happened because we heard the bill, we ultimately worked the bill, and the bill failed to get out of committee. Would have been eliminating the use of restraints on juveniles that were coming into court. So not specifically, this was referencing the Cedric Lofton situation, and they had a whole group that has made recommendations that I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of those recommendations later in the committee. But we did have a bill about restraints as a whole, and that failed to get out of committee.
Committee, any other questions? Saying none, thank you. I think we're ready to move on. Spence Cohen, are you here? Yes, you are. Spence Cohen is here to talk about court services. Okay, first of all, let's double check. Is his testimony on here? Okay. Yep, there it is. His testimony's on page 2. It's attachment 6. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Senator Baumgartner and committee members, I really thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of give you an overview of what court services does. And I'll just really going to touch on the highlights of some of our services that we provide.
Mic on?
It is.
Okay.
I will. Is this better?
It is. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. All right, so I'm Spence Cohen. I work with the Office of Judicial Administration. I'm the Court Services Specialist, which basically means I'm kind of the liaison between the judicial branch and all of our court services officers throughout the state of Kansas. So really just a quick history of how court services came to be. In 1972, our Kansas Constitution was amended that directed we have a unified court system. And so those provisions really came into place specifically for court services in 1979. Prior to that, there was a juvenile and misdemeanor probation really varied state to state on who supervised those individuals, and felony probation was carried out by Department of Corrections officers. So from 79 on is when court services began. Moving to now, as you all know, we have 31 judicial districts in the state of Kansas, and we have offices or chief probation officers in each one of those judicial districts. We currently have 403 court services officers throughout the state, and we do have individuals in each of the 105 counties throughout the state. And we all do fall under the judicial branch. We're all judicial branch employees. So really just talking about our statutory duties, and I'm going to break this down between adults and juveniles for you. So I'll talk first about our adults. So this is just listing what our statutory duties are. We do pretrial supervision, or often referred to as bond supervision. We do pre-sentence investigations. We conduct risk need assessments. We can supervise house arrest. We do supervision, often called probation. And we also do dispute resolution for adults. So one of the major parts, and this is where I'll get a little more into the weeds of what we do, is pre-sentence investigations. So the pre-sentence investigation, often referred to as PSI, you may hear that, is really what assists the court in determining the sentences for those convicted of felonies in the state. We do occasionally do pre-sentence investigations on misdemeanors, but those are only if the judge orders us to do those. They're not quite as intensive as what we do for felonies. Part of what the court services does is we'll make appropriate recommendations for conditions of probation also to assist the judge so they know what the needs might be of the defendant. So showing, and I don't know if any of you all know what a pre-sentence investigation looks like. I brought a blank copy and I'd be happy to share. There also can be found on the Kansas Sentencing Commission website. They have a list of all their forms, and one of those is the pre-sentence investigation. Depending on how many convictions an individual may have, it can really blow up the how many pages are in a PSI. So it lists the offense, it gives all the information of the defendant, and it'll list the range of recommended sentences that should be placed. So our officers, what they do is they basically look at the Kansas sentencing grid. If you all have seen this before, it's also can be found on the Kansas sentencing. There's a drug grid, which I know you all have referenced this morning already, and a non-drug grid. So this is really what our officers use to determine the sentence and put appropriate recommendations for the judge. So just as kind of an example, if you had an individual, and I realize that this is hard to see, and I'll be happy to share my laminated copy or get you copies, whatever you all would prefer. But we would take, if an individual, for instance, had a level 7 residential burglary offense. The level 7 is the severity level. And if they had 3 non-person offenses, it puts them in a category, which would be a level E, 3 non-person offenses. And as we look at the severity level 7, it gives a Department of Corrections sentence of 23, 21, or 19 months. So that's what we would put on the PSI for the judge to reference, and then the judges are able to make their decision of the sentence based on that. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question. So when you are doing the pre-sentence investigation, is there anything on that, in that packet that asks if the individual had ever been in foster care?
No, there is not. Not at this point. Not saying it can't be added. That's something the Sentencing Commission often makes recommendations for documents, or the legislature can do that.
We will be making that recommendation, because until we start tracking that, and that this really does stem from, I served on the Domestic Fatality Review Board. And one of the things that they found is, so when they went and did the interviews with the individuals that were serving life sentences, guess what was the common denominator? Foster care. And so when you do the risk and needs assessment, so what, do you do an ACEs assessment?
We don't do one of those. And I'll talk a little bit about our risk needs assessments.
Okay.
And I can talk about that now and skip forward, or I can just continue. And
We'll
I was
continue.
trying to just go with the flow of how we do the pre-sentence investigation, but I definitely will talk about risk needs and how that works.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, going back to the sentencing grid, it will also give recommendations. There are different boxes. All of white are presumptive prison cases where the judge should put the defendant in with the Department of Corrections. Blues give discretion. They're called border boxes, which they can either go to probation or prison. The presumptive is prison, but they can give them to probation without giving a departure. And then all of the greenish boxes are presumptive probation, and those are cases that shall go to probation without a departure. One of the things that often complicates these cases, though, is the special rules. As you all know, our sentencing rules, there are 41 of them currently that our officers must be experts in as well to know if something extra applies. So for instance, with the residential burglary offense that I talked about earlier, which would be a level 7E, there are 3 special rules that we would have to know about in order to see if there's maybe a presumptive prison. So special rule, and I'm just going to give you quick examples. Special Rule 13 states that there's a residential burglary with one prior residential, non-residential, or aggravated burglary, it makes the defendant presumptive prison. There's also Special Rule 47, which has to do with criminal history categories. So if they're in a certain category, even while it may be a presumptive probation, that places them in special rule to be presumptive prison. And then there's also Special Rule 27, which talks about having 2 or more prior thefts, burglaries, or aggravated burglaries, would also make that individual presumptive prison. So with those 41 special rules, our officers really do become the experts when it comes to sentencing. I did bring also, Sentencing Commission provided, this is our desk reference manual, and this really is for sentencing. It talks about everything. So CSOs are really experts in this book and everything that's entailed in that. Our judges and attorneys often ask at sentencing why a special rule may or may not apply, so our officers need to know that, and they're very good at knowing what these rules are. But it is very intensive, and it depends on people's lives, so they need to make sure they're doing everything correctly.
Senator Fosco-Godot.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on that point there that you just made, so that sentencing grid or guideline, does it just look at the crime, or does it consider if that individual has previously been in trouble? Does the judge have a little leeway there of discretion, considering?
So part of what we do is a criminal history add criminal history that. We review all the convictions the defendant may have in the past or does have. That's included in the pre-sentence investigation. So it will list any convictions. We do list expungements, but those are not made public. Diversions don't count, so we don't list diversions unless it's a DUI. And then we will list those diversions as those are statutorily required to be counted. So the grid up top, it goes from A to I, with A being 3 person felonies, down to I, which is 1 or no misdemeanors. So it just moves up based on how many different types of offenses they have. And it's, other than H and I, all the other categories are based on felonies. So 1 non-person felony is a level G versus 1 person felony moves them up from here to a D. And then the sentences go up substantially with the higher criminal history. Yes.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On their 18th birthday, they get a clean slate?
No, we do list juvenile offenses. There's also, so part of it is there's also what's called decay. So depending on how long between offenses, if they're 18 when they committed offense and they're 30 now, those cases will drop off depending on the type of offense. So if it's a more serious felony, that might stay. I don't remember right offhand. It's been a while since I've written one of these pre-sentence investigations, but there are rules on how long these cases last, but they do get listed on the pre-sentence investigation.
So if he carjacked, thank you, Madam Chair. If he carjacks at 16, it'll stay with him when he's 23?
It will show on the criminal history. It doesn't necessarily mean it will count against him on that criminal history. Again, it just depends. They call it the decay rule. So we look at that. And then when we list the criminal history, they're all coded, and it would, for instance, if it was decayed, it would say JFD, which would refer to juvenile felony decayed. So it lists it, but it doesn't count. Sure, you're welcome. Okay. So talking about risk needs assessments. So the risk needs assessments that we use are determined by the Kansas Sentencing Commission. They're completed as part of the pre-sentence investigation for all border box and presumptive probation cases. We don't do them on presumptive prison cases. Occasionally, if we know a case might be departed, our officers will do that to help assist the judge. But otherwise, it's only on border box and presumptive probation cases. So that risk level is what's used to determine the recommended placement between court services and community corrections. So in January 1st, 2021, the Sentencing Commission directed that we use different assessments. Prior to that date, we were using the Level of Services Inventory revised, the LSIR, and now for offenses 7-1 of 21 and on, we use, and I wrote 22 on there, I apologize, it should be 21. We use the LSCMI for males, the Level of Services Case Management Inventory. And for females, we use the WARNA, which is the Women's Risk Need Assessment. So the Sentencing Commission acknowledged that females are entering the system differently than males, and they have different risks and needs areas. Females generally enter the system nonviolent, drug-related type offenses versus males, which do have the more violent. So at that point, the WARNA also addresses for females specific areas that are more prevalent for them, such as trauma and abuse. Part of the assessments that we do, all of them look at criminal history, education, employment, family, their companions, alcohol and drug issues, mental health issues, and their attitudes. So, and then the females also address, for the female assessment, also addresses abuse and trauma, or some of the highlights of that anyway. I've got numbers coming up, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. So currently, the placement of who goes to community corrections and who goes to court services is dependent on the risk level. So these assessments, they really look at risk and needs, but for the court purposes, for placement, they're looking at the risk to recidivate. Placement recommendations for felony females to court services are those that score low and moderate risk. And for males, those are the ones that score very low, low, and medium. And so there's a little discrepancy between moderate and medium. The tools use different language for what moderate and medium means. So that's why it looks a little bit different. While moderate are going to court services for females, and mediums go to community corrections for females, while medium goes to medium risk for the LSCMI goes to males. So that's the discrepancy. They just use different languages. So while these risk needs assessments, they do determine risk, they also show the needs of the defendant. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Our officers, when they do these assessments, they will take the needs and include that in the pre-sentence investigation, make recommendations to judges on special rules. So for instance, if the individual discusses, they might have a drug and alcohol issue, then the officer would likely put down that, recommend to the judge that they do a drug and alcohol evaluation and then follow all recommendations made. So these assessments are done pre-sentence. They do take anywhere from 45 minutes to, they can take a couple hours to complete. So it does take a substantial bit of time. The numbers are shown here on how many assessments we completed in 2022 on felonies. And again, that LSIR number, those numbers will continue to go down as time goes on, as we get through those individuals that are committing offenses before 2021. So the goal of these assessments is really to assess and determining the placement at sentencing, but as an officer, we really use these to help address things that the defendant may need to be more successful on probation. And then the officers will address those needs throughout the probation to make sure, to assist that they won't recidivate their probation or come back later. Our officers do go through extensive training on these assessments. Currently, we use the University of Cincinnati Criminal Justice Institute to do all of our training for the LSCMI, the male version of the risk needs assessment, and Bauman Consulting Group for the WARNA, the women's risk need assessment. And we use different providers because the Bauman Consultant, they are really the experts for the WARNA. The University of Cincinnati did not do the WARNA at the time that we contracted with them. So you can see here the hours of training that our officers go through to complete these assessments or to become certified. The breakdown is an adult officer doing these assessments, they're looking at doing over 116 hours of training on these assessments. So they really become experts in how to do these and how to work with the individuals that are coming through the system. In addition to those, we also use EPICS, which is Effective Practices in Community Supervision. That's a requirement for juveniles, but our officers also do use them for adults in assisting to change behaviors. And we also, and recently we've been instituting motivational interviewing, which really helps just building rapport, talking with the clients to get them to open up and to help with the communication between the officers and the defendants. We do require that our officers maintain certification. We do this by doing booster trainings. Previously with the LSIR, our officers every year after certification, the next year they attend more training, 4 hours of training with the University of Cincinnati Criminal Justice Institute, and just basically reviewing the assessments to make sure we're scoring them correctly, doing them the way that's recommended. We recently changed last year. We started using the University of Cincinnati Certify system, which is really more of a QA, quality assurance type of system, where our officers will review an assessment online. They'll watch a recording of an interview. They will go through and score that assessment, and then the system scores it. They have it all down, and they will see if our officers pass or fail that. So the officers are allowed to miss a total of 3 questions without failing. So it's, when you're looking at anywhere between, I want to say the LSCMI has 74, maybe it's more than that, questions now. It's really a short margin that they have to not pass that. So they really need to know the systems and be able to interview these individuals correctly. For the WARNA, they are still using the kind of our previous system with Bauman Consultants, they have a 4-hour required training that they do every year to maintain their certification. So another one of the major duties of court services is our probation. And then these are the numbers that we had under our supervision at the end of fiscal year 2022. So you can see misdemeanors, we had 8,267. And this is people, not cases, as we know. They can have more than one case, but we're only at this point tracking the number of individuals that we supervise. And we also supervise 2,876 felony individuals. And so just something I did want to note is while we do supervise low, moderate, or medium risk felonies, for the misdemeanors, we all know that, you know, these just because it's a misdemeanor case doesn't necessarily mean that they're low risk. As stated, we deal with more and more individuals. I know you have a meeting coming up about mental health, and we see a large population with mental health needs. Over the years that I've done this job, it's increased dramatically, which leads to all kinds of issues, drugs and alcohol, other types of disabilities. So the misdemeanors that we supervise aren't necessarily low risk. They might have been pled down from a felony. They might have extensive criminal history. They might have extensive needs with drugs or alcohol issues or mental health issues. So we do supervise all risk levels when it comes to misdemeanors. And it's just a really varied population. So, you know, the supervision really entails just making sure they're following court orders and assisting them to follow those by setting up treatment and following the defendant, helping them to get the needs that they have so that they don't come back later. We also, as I'm sure this committee knows, specialty courts are really expanding in Kansas, and court service officers are involved in some specialty courts, such as veterans courts or drugs courts. I believe you all will hear about drug courts this afternoon. So that is something our officers are involved in as well. We also supervised at the end of the year 1,174 diversion cases. So we do some diversions, and that just varies district to district who does those. Along with probation supervision, our CSOs also do domestic cases doing dispute resolution. Dispute resolution really includes doing mediations, conciliations, parenting coordination, case management, and we also do home studies. Our mediators, again, just to kind of hammer home how much training our officers are doing, you know, to become a mediator, they're doing 40 hours of training to become certified, just to become a mediator, and then they're maintaining that certification every year by doing the required continuing education hours. Those CSOs that do conciliation, parenting coordination, and case management, they even have more additional hours that they complete every year. You know, and these services are really beneficial in that they help the courts in reducing their dockets and the time that they spend on each cases. So moving on to our statutory duties for juveniles. Pretrial supervision, again, or bond supervision. We do predisposition reports and risk need assessments. We can monitor house arrest, as mentioned a little bit by Natalie. We do immediate intervention or IIP programs, and then sync supervision. So that immediate intervention program, or IIP, is really much like the juvenile or the adult diversion, but for juveniles. It's really just to get them to taste what the criminal justice system is without getting them fully involved. And it's more of a hands-off approach. The time spent with these juveniles is quite a bit less. They have shorter supervision times and a lot less conditions of supervision to follow. So I know a question was asked. That's really done at the district level to determine if it's done by community corrections or court services. The districts decide who supervises that, and those are offered by the county attorney, is the one who decides if they are offered IIP or not. Again, the predisposition report is similar to those for adults, but then rather than following the sentencing grids, as this committee heard earlier, we're following the juvenile matrix. And we also do assessments for those. Assessments are required to be completed on all juveniles pre-disposition. So once they've been found, once they've been adjudicated, we will do an assessment. And for that assessment, we're using the Youth Level of Services Inventory, or the YLS. And it's fairly similar to what the adults tools are, in that they're looking at criminal history, their family, education, their peer relationships, drug and alcohol issues, their recreational activities, what their attitudes and behaviors are like. So in 2022, we completed fiscal year 2022, we completed 1,441 assessments on juveniles. And again, our training for those follows the same as that we do for adults, and that they're doing their yearly certification and the same amount of hours to become certified. For juvenile supervision, in fiscal year 2022, we supervised 671 juveniles, and then 2,326 juvenile diversions and IIP cases. Another duty, and juvenile supervision is, as you all discussed a little bit ago, is different than the adult, the way the sanctions work. So we follow the juvenile code book versus the adult statutes. In 2022, we also supervised 2,376 SYNC, or child in need of care cases. For those SYNC cases, our CSOs really do a lot of different roles. They help with reintegration and placing the child back in the care of the parents. And they do that by assisting the needs of the parents and really assisting in monitoring to make sure that those needs are getting met and addressed. Those cases generally can last from 6 months to 2 years until permanency is found. And during that time, the CSOs will make recommendations for court orders and submit court reports. They also monitor informal supervision cases, or those that are occurred before adjudication. And that's kind of like a diversion for SYNC cases. And again, they assist the parties in getting the resources, following through, addressing identified needs, so that the child may remain in the home versus getting placed out of home. During fiscal year 2022, our officers filed 908 SYNC reports. And our CSOs are often involved with cases when the child may be placed in DCF custody, but at that point, they're really more of a point of contact for the court. It's kind of a flow of information. So if there's DCF, other partners involved, the CSO is kind of monitoring and submits reports to the court for as kind of a point of contact. Moving on real quickly, as our courts, you may know, are going through a new case management system. They're moving to Odyssey, and our courts now, it's in 100 different counties. We just have our major urban counties left to finish. But along with that, our probation officers have also moving to a new case management system, which we call Tyler Supervision. Currently, we're in 9 districts. In a couple weeks, we'll be moving into 9 more districts. And then, as you can see, through 2023, we'll be adding 11 more, and then the final district will be completed in 2024. What's really good about this is I know data drives a lot of decisions, and with this system, we'll be able to provide real-time data to you if you were to ask about ages of individuals, how long they've been on supervision. It's really a comprehensive case management system or tool for our officers to be able to track what's going on with each person that they touch. And with that, I see I might be a minute over, so I apologize. But I will answer any questions you may have or be happy to provide you information later.
We're good. Committee questions. Senator Fauske.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, state the name of the group that kind of networks with everyone regarding that juvenile or in the SYNC cases.
For our child in need of care cases, our officers, and this is primarily within just a couple judicial districts. It does not happen statewide by any means. But in a couple of our urban districts where there are a lot of SYNC cases, our officers are involved with those. And I believe it's in the 18th and the 29th are primarily the districts that those cases. And our officers are kind of spearhead. They're not necessarily making decisions, that if DCF is involved, that DCF is doing it, but court services is making sure things are moving forward and helps report that to our judges.
So are they, do they meet in person, a round table? Is it by Zoom? Is it by phone? Do they keep that documentation, and then who do they share it with? The court services and DCF?
I would have to check to make sure I'm correct about this, but I know that they share their reports with the court. They file those reports with the court. And I can't say specifically right now how they have those meetings. They're not meeting with the youth. They're meeting with DCF or the other providers to be able to provide what's going on, that information to the court.
And Madam Chair, my concern is just to kind of track that information. If we could, maybe you could have them do that in-house to track that so that we have that information. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And with our new probation system, that's kind of one of the, I mean, you know, everything is evolving, and that with this system will be much easier to track what exactly is going on, what work is being done versus our previous system. So we will be able to provide more data on that in the future. Yes.
Committee, other questions? Can you share with us, you know, anecdotally how your number, you know, you gave the number of diversions and the number of misdemeanors, felonies, and so forth under supervision for adults, as well as the numbers for the juveniles. How has that changed pre-COVID, COVID, and where we are today?
Yeah, sure. I think, and I can provide those numbers to you, what our supervision numbers were for the last several years. I'm happy to do that. But during COVID, the numbers definitely dropped down in supervision statewide about the number of cases the courts were hearing. I think it's slowly starting to tick up as dockets are getting filled up, as juries are finally being met again. So those numbers, the numbers that we have now will certainly tick up. It's hard to say how fast that'll go up or by how many, but the numbers did drop. I'm not going to say substantial, not like thousands of numbers, but they did drop during the pandemic with the less court hearings.
Okay.
Yes.
I assume that as crime continues, but as they're finishing up on that backlog, there's a high demand now.
Yeah, I know our courts are specifically with jury trials, quite backed up, but trying to catch up. So, you know, a lot of those are jury trial cases that are going to take a little bit longer, that have slowed down. And I don't want to speak for all our courts, because I certainly don't know, as I'm not with our judges every day. But I do know that they're slowly catching up with their backlogs.
I am not seeing that there are any further questions. Spence, thank you so much
you're
for being
welcome.
here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you for your information. Committee, we are scheduled to take a break. We're going to take a break, and Stuart Little, are lunches out there?
Not yet. Those should be here by 11:59.
Okay. So we'll take a break. When the lunches are here, grab one, come back in, and we'll get started when we are back together. again so that we stay great on time. First of all, want to thank Stuart Little with Little Government Relations for providing the lunch so that we would have a working lunch. So thank you so much for that, Stuart. Before we have our two speakers come up, we do have maps that we're just going to distribute. Meredith's going to hand those out. And that's to guide us for when we go on our tour. So keep in mind that after we have our presentations on community corrections, we will be going to the Shawnee County Community Corrections Office for the tour. And then we're going to be going from there to the Shawnee County District Courthouse, where we are going to be observing drug court. So we're going to get an upfront and personal with what that all means. We will be back at the State House at 3:15 to work on that community task force to review youth correction system standards. So there is an opportunity for shuttle. I know that Stuart has a vehicle where 3 people can ride. If you guys want to carpool, that's great. If you want to walk, I think we're in the 50s, but I don't know what the wind chill's like. But the expectation is if you walk, you got to walk back also. So I think we can figure out how to get to and from. But at this time, I would like to call on Shelley Williams. She is the director of the Riley County Community Corrections. Shelley, thank you so much for being here today.
Madam Chairman, I can't hear her.
She hasn't started yet. We're getting her PowerPoint set up.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think your mic's on. Push the.
Okay, start over.
There we go.
Good morning. My name is Shelley Williams, and I am the director.
I can't hear her.
She hasn't started yet. We're getting her PowerPoint set up.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Okay, third time's a charm. Good morning. My name is Shelley Williams, and I am the director of Riley County Community Corrections and a member of the Kansas Community Corrections Association. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. The purpose of my testimony today is to provide an overview of community supervision or probation and parole in Kansas. You may have seen this slide in the past, as former Deputy Secretary of Corrections Hope Cooper actually created the slide, and our association, with permission, expanded the information. The community supervision structure is unique in Kansas, in that 3 types of supervision are all under different branches of government. Starting on the left, you will see the judicial branch, where the Office of Judicial Administration oversees court services. Court services are state employees. The counties fund their operations, and the counties provide space. They supervise misdemeanor probation, low and moderate risk felony probation, and they also do compact misdemeanor probation. As you move over to the right, you have the executive branch, wherein the Kansas Department of Corrections provides funding and oversight for community corrections agencies. However, they are directly under the supervision of county commissions, are county employees, but are state grant funded with no statutory mandate that the counties provide space. Community corrections agencies provide moderate and high-risk felony probation, as well as Senate Bill 123 probation, and all of these are assigned by the district court. You also have parole under the Kansas Department of Corrections, and they are actually Kansas Department of Corrections employees, state employees, and KDOC funded. They also do post-release supervision and compact felony probation. And I apologize, compact means interstate, between states, and so it's just shortened for compact. Are there any questions on this structure slide before I go on to the next slide?
Senator Falscadeau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So say that again. You said one of the branches,
so
the funding, the funding piece of it.
So community corrections is state funded. However, they are under the structure of county government. So they actually answer to the county commissioners, but 100% state funded. Okay. The juvenile supervision structure is similar, minus conditional release of juvenile offenders, which is equivalent to parole on the adult side, is overseen by the community corrections agencies. Another difference with the juvenile structure is some juvenile supervision agencies actually contract out, and they're not necessarily under a community corrections agency. And so you have court service juvenile offenders as well as community corrections assigned juvenile offenders. Further breaking down the structures at the local level, you can see that there is the option of 2 advisory boards, and most jurisdictions that are larger probably have 2 advisory boards, wherein some of the medium to smaller sizes have combined their corrections advisory boards into one. And so you have adult community corrections advisory board as well as juvenile corrections advisory board. And as an example, in Manhattan, ours is just called the Joint Corrections Advisory Board, and we have combined those 2 boards to meet the statutory requirements of both boards. Adult community supervision under community corrections has to follow the Community Correction Act, which begins with 75-5290. The Act outlines services that must be provided, who is to serve on the advisory boards, how our grants are administered, reporting requirements, among other things, are all contained in that Community Corrections Act. Regarding the placement of offenders by the courts, we get felony offenders, those that are presumptive prison sentence but receive a non-prison sentence as part of a result of a departure, severity level 7 or higher offenses, offenders who violate conditions of release, and of course, high risk or high needs, or both. And then, of course, the recommended caseload sizes varies from agency to agency. This is kind of a national average. The ADP, or average daily population, represents all adult felony offenders under community corrections supervision. You see a significant drop in the number of offenders in 2021, which were under supervision of community corrections agencies. And of course, this is a direct result of COVID, with courts being shut down, among other things. Anecdotally, and speaking to my peers across the state, those numbers are starting to go back up, and in some areas quite significantly. In the final slide of the overview, highlights both statewide success rates as well as those that were revoked and sent to prison over the last 5 years. The last 5 years, we have averaged a 72.92% success rate and a 27.08% revocation rate. And if you can see the slide, it also gives the number of offenders who were either diverted from the prison system as a result of being successfully closed, or those who actually were sent to prison to serve their underlying sentence. So that is a really brief and quick overview of the community corrections as well as extended community supervision in Kansas. Are there any additional questions?
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You said like 28% or so come back. Does that count for all states? I mean, the success rate, let's say they go to Colorado or go to Oklahoma. Can that be traced back to that? And does that go back into the 28%?
So these would just be for Kansas cases that are closed and revoked and sent to Kansas prisons.
So the kid could screw up here, move to Colorado, and screw up there, and it wouldn't be in those statistics.
Not in our statistics.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you for your time.
So we've got Randy Rieger. He's the Reno County Community Corrections and also the president of the Kansas Community Corrections Association.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Randy Rieger, and I'm the Director of Reno County Community Corrections and the President of the Kansas Community Corrections Association. Thank you for allowing us this time to talk with you about the needs we're seeing in the supervision of felony offenders in our community. Last year, we came before you with what we believed was a first step in improving community corrections supervision. We asked for an increase of $14.3 million to increase wages to a competitive level and to add supervision officers. Agencies across the state were seeing an increased number of qualified, trained staff leave for other agencies or leave the field altogether for better paying jobs. This loss of knowledge and experience is cut deep in agencies. And the result of this turnover is the people we supervise aren't receiving the supervision and assistance they need. It takes time to train new officers. Many of the people we supervise are resistant to change, or they're so entrenched in their criminal lifestyles they don't even think change is they're capable of change. For many of them, all they have are criminal or addicted family and friends. The idea of changing seems impossible and means giving up all they've known. For officers, building the skills and techniques to help this population takes years. Agencies were losing this talent as experienced staff were leaving for better pay. The request we made last year was very much focused on supporting the staff who provide direct supervision to the population we supervise. Agencies across the state were very happy when they heard of the additional funding had been approved. First, the $9.2 million was approved for FY23 to target increased wages for staff. Then above what we had expected or asked for, an additional $2.6 million was approved for the end of FY22. Agencies and staff felt very supported and encouraged by this increased funding. After nearly 10 years of flat or reduced funding, community corrections officers received the message that the difficult work that they were doing mattered to the state. So first off, we want to thank you for your support and advocacy for this additional funding. For many agencies, this funding meant that they were able to raise wages and prevent staff from leaving or looking for other jobs. Many of the people who work in this field really love the work they do, but even you enjoy the work, at some point, if the pay isn't meeting your needs, you have to consider other options. For many officers, this wage increase enabled them to remain at community corrections. Being able to retain these motivated and skilled staff has a big impact on the work we do. Research shows that the relationship between an officer and a probationer has a large influence on whether the person will be successful or not. Officers who are well cared for are better able to help the population they serve. The wage increases have reduced the stress in officers' lives, which make them more effective and energized to help this difficult population. This increase came at a time when the agencies were trying to fill vacancies. This increased wages has allowed them to be more competitive with with other employers in a difficult labor market. While the funding increase was beneficial for many agencies, some agencies ran into challenges. The focus of our request was to increase wages for staff, and this was the focus of the additional funding. However, the funding was very prescribed when it was released to agencies. This resulted in some agencies, including Johnson County, not being able to use the money at all. Even though they needed the money, agencies weren't allowed to use the increase for FY22 and it had to be sent back to the Department of Corrections. So the same thing will happen with the increase for FY23. As you can imagine, staff were deflated. They'd been excited about and celebrated the increased funding, only to be told they weren't getting a raise and the agency couldn't use the money. We believe the solution is simple. First, we would ask that the current increase and future increases be rolled into the regular grant application process. The grant process and funds are already highly regulated. Budgets have to be approved by our advisory boards, county commissions, and the Department of Corrections. Carving this money out creates additional administrative work, both for agency staff as well as the Department of Corrections. We also request that agencies be allowed to retain unexpended funds at the end of each fiscal year. Specifically, with the additional funding we received for this fiscal year, we'd ask that the agencies be allowed to retain the funds to be used for wider purposes within the current grant rules and guidelines. For example, the wages in some districts were already fairly competitive. Those agencies may not have needed to increase wages. Rather, their need was to add additional supervision officers. Due to flat and reduced funding over the past years, many agencies had to choose between having few officers and paying them a fair wage, or having more officers but paying them very low wages. This has resulted in some agencies needing to add officers more than needing to increase wages. Allowing agencies to retain unexpended funds also makes them more efficient and better consumers. Rather than getting to the end of the year and spending money on equipment or supplies that could have waited, agencies feel pressure to make the purchases not knowing if they'll be able to afford it the next year. Some years agencies have had higher unexpended funds due to turnover. Allowing them to retain these funds allows them to better plan for next year and be more efficient with state tax dollars. As I mentioned earlier, our request last year was part of a phased approach to improve the effectiveness of community corrections agencies. For FY24, our first request is to increase grant funds by $6 million for operational costs. Prior to the additional funding for wage increases approved last year, community corrections had 8 years of flat or reduced funding. The inflation rate over that period of time has resulted in the need for an additional $6 million in grant funds. As we're all experiencing, the current rate of inflation is creating challenges, and our agencies are no different. The cost of supplies and services is increasing, so we have to find places to cut. The problem is, agencies have been doing this for nearly 10 years. We've ran out of places to cut. We're asking ourselves, do I reduce or stop drug testing? Do I reduce or eliminate services to help clients be successful? Or do I have to cut a staff position so I can afford rent? Adding this funding to our grants will allow advisory boards, county commissions, and the county commissions the opportunity to decide the best use of these funds for the local community. Last year, we asked for funding to add officers statewide so we could reduce caseloads and be more effective in supervision. Since this was not approved, we're asking for $4.5 million to add approximately 50 officers statewide. Reducing caseloads allows officers more time to spend with each person they supervise. This is more time to work on behavior change, more time to ensure compliance with court orders, and more time to ensure community safety. The awareness of mental illness is a national movement. Here locally in Kansas, work is being done to reduce the number of people with mental illness in jails and prisons. Most of the people under supervision are addicted to substances, and for many of them, their addiction is linked to past trauma, mental illness, or both. If probationers don't receive the mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment in the community, it's likely they'll end up in jail or prison. Treating these conditions in jail or prison is rarely effective or the best method, and certainly isn't the most affordable option. The behavioral health grant allocation for community corrections has been $3 million since the grant started in FY14. We're requesting an additional $1 million in this grant. This money is primarily used to pay for mental health services and medications, substance abuse treatment services, and behavior change interventions. We use these funds to help people make changes to get their lives on the right path towards successful integration into the community. In summary, I again want to thank you on behalf of the community corrections agencies across the state for the additional funding and your support. After years of flat or reduced funding, the increase last year acted to stop the deterioration of the community corrections program and loss of skilled and knowledgeable staff. But this was just the first step in addressing the needs within our communities. For FY24, we're asking for a total increase in our grant allocations of $11.5 million. The goal of community corrections is to provide public safety and reduce the number of people going to prison. We can't make progress in changing the behavior of people we supervise without the right resources. Agencies need this money added to the grant process to be able to keep up with inflation, to be able to hire and retain qualified staff, and to be able to address behavioral health needs of people on supervision. We need this money to be effective with the high-risk population, to reduce the number of people being sent to prison, and to keep our communities safe. We ask the additional funding approved last year and any future increase simply be included in the normal grant allocation process so local advisory boards and county commissions can make the decision as to how funding can best be used. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, committee, let's ask questions. We're going to start with Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Reguera, I remember, I believe it was a conversation you and I had where I had the revelation that community corrections was 100% grant funded, and that bothered me, knowing that, you know, community corrections has such a substantial piece of the recidivism rate influence. In other words, how often people go back to jail for the crimes they're committing. With an effective community corrections, we can lessen that, but we don't think about that when we're looking at the numbers for funding this grant. We look at all kinds of things that affect bed space, and it seems that this gets put behind us or out of our sight. I can tell you that I very much appreciate the community corrections operations in our county and how they work with us and law enforcement. I'm glad now that our courthouse was able to find space for you so you're not having to rent a building downtown in the back room of a lawyer's office. And so anyway, considerations here I think should be taken seriously, and we should act on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, community corrections really is a cost avoidance tool. When that money is invested up front, we're saving our return on our investment is very significant on the back end. Thank you.
Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me. On the $4.5 million to increase staff, it sounds like workload would be maybe one of the biggest issues for retaining staff, recruiting staff. Is that, you believe, with existing pay, benefits, and then being able to offer a decreased workload that you'd be able to recruit these positions and keep them filled?
That's a piece of it. What we're really looking at is overall caseload sizes. Shelley Williams put up a few numbers on what a caseload should look like. Right now, they're statewide, they're just too high. And that's causing the need for the additional officers. When those caseloads are so high, for me, it's less about burnout than it is about making sure the clients get the services they need. Because if you don't have the time to spend with a high-risk offender, the chances that they're going to be back in custody increases. So it's just really important that they actually have time to build those relationships and focus on the core skills to help them change their behavior. Because, like I said, a lot of these people have had a lifetime of training in what we would consider not productive things. And so unless they have that time to really work a person through making changes in their life, we can't be successful with that population.
Senator Foscato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Randy, hi. Earlier I said Randy, but then Randall, who we call Randy, actually looked too. So, but thank you for your testimony. Regarding the funds that you're requesting today, so do you have a breakdown of how much that would be for one's individual pay, hourly pay, or salary pay? And is that also for sign-on bonuses? Yeah.
Okay, one of the unique things about community corrections is they're all operated by their own counties. So pay is different across the state based on the county's payroll policy. So each agency does that. So you might have an agency that would do a sign-on bonus, but that wouldn't be typical across the state. And it's the same thing with wages and benefits. They're different across the state. So it's really hard to give any type of breakdown as to what that looks like.
Okay. Okay. I'll accept that answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, actually, I think it would be helpful. Are you able to get back to your slide deck?
Yes. Where would you like me to go?
Well, let's go with one of your earlier ones where you talked about the money that was received and how you weren't able to use it. And so I think it might be,
This one or the next one?
right here.
Here we go.
Challenges. So,
Sure.
so talk us through, and don't be afraid to name names as far as examples.
Okay.
Because when we just say, some counties do this, some counties do that, give us an example of specific counties that you know of, just so we can kind of get our brain around. And we understand that each county is going to run it differently.
Correct. So when this money was released out to agencies, we were told that we could not use that to add any staff. The only thing we could use that for is to increase wages for staff. That was the only use. So, and there was a max amount. So for a Johnson County, it's a very urban area, their wages were already at an appropriate rate. Reno County, we're in the same boat. Our wages in Reno County, we follow the Office of Judicial Administration pay scale. Our wages are already at an acceptable level, in my opinion. For our agency, we needed to add staff. Johnson County, their issue was kind of similar. So what it did is it tied their hands. And so what they were told is you cannot use any of that funding because you are not going to use it to raise wages. So for Reno County, we were able to use some of that money because we were at that pay scale. Our grant funds did not meet what we needed to pay that OJ pay scale. The additional increase we received for FY22 and FY23 actually funded us to pay at the appropriate level. We had to tap into other funds to pay those wages if we would not have received that. So that's a couple examples of how that looked across the state, is some agencies just weren't able to use that and it has to be returned to the department.
You lost employees when the year prior, the increase of money was given to the judicial branch. Is that correct?
Correct.
So judicial services got additional funding, and you had some of your offices that were almost completely wiped out because of that jumping ship and going to something different but very similar.
Correct.
Correct. How many of the counties would you say have their pay scale essentially married to what is the judicial pay scale?
Off the top of my head, I would estimate 4 to 5 agencies use the OJA pay scale. I would be surprised if it's any more than that.
Okay. So it's very inconsistent from county to county.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So the money was just returned. Do you have a sense of how much money was returned?
I believe Johnson County indicated that.
I think it's in the written testimony.
Correct. They submitted written testimony, so I'd refer you to that. I believe either Keith or Robert Sullivan provided written testimony, and I think they named the specific amount. I remember reading that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you, Shelley. It looks like it's going to be around $370,000 between the two fiscal years. 47,000 last year and another 323,000 this year.
Okay. Representative Hoffman, welcome and go to town.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this was not ARPA money. This was, if I remember, this was a state general fund increase.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, so we didn't put that, and I'm looking to our staff, we didn't put that into our budget, that was the requirement, did we? Or is that something the judiciary decided? Did we? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. I don't think we put that in the budget language.
Is that something that we could look up, or do we know?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we, during session, we kind of all staff judiciary and corrections, so we'll have to ask our budget folks, but we can get that for you.
Yeah, because I don't think we did, and that's, I mean, it's not a lot of money when you figure, but it still would help quite a bit if some of these agencies aren't able to add people simply because of that. So it's something that I don't think we intended at all on the Budget Committee.
Is that something that we're going to have to wait until this afternoon, or do you think we'll be able to find it fairly soon? Okay. Well, and I think it's, so I appreciate that you're here, not only in your capacity within Reno County, but also from the standpoint of that statewide. Because what often does occur is legislature makes a funding approval, and then within the own agency, they have, I think you heard about it, we had an amendment, a constitutional amendment that was about rules and regs. So an agency creates their own rules and regulations about what's to happen with, in this case, it would be how that money will be dispersed and how it can be utilized, even though that was never the intention of the legislature. It was, you need to address your local needs. We're going to give you funding to help you. Might not be all of the ask, but to help in that. We continue to battle that issue of unintended consequences. Now, we see that come up with actual laws that we pass, but I think many of us have seen more and more examples of unintended consequences when we are simply approving funding to go out throughout the state. And that's where those rules and regs really get manipulated and distorted. And again, I don't know if you were here earlier when we were talking, the worst thing is to have funding to try and make it available, and it's there, but you guys just can't reach it or use it in the way that you need. So let's go back to your slide. I think the one that you were just at.
Okay.
Because your solutions, because I think the solutions have to be a little bit more specific. I understand that ability of retaining unexpended funds. So basically, you would be able to roll it forward.
Correct.
So we get away from that use it or lose it issue. So keeping it and rolling it forward. But I don't know, like even when I see that, even in the grant process, I still see how a branch could come up with rules and regs and it still doesn't solve the problem. So that is one of those things, since you're president, that we really do when we are having hearings, be it for funding, be it for the House Corrections Committee or the Senate Judiciary, we truly need someone, and this is going to sound very picky, but I have been in caucus where, well, the opponent testimony was just a letter, or the proponent testimony was just a letter, as opposed to someone physically being, that was the distinction. It was more powerful because when you come and testify, you provide the letter anyway, but the fact that someone was physically here. So as we broach any of these solutions that are your ask,
Okay.
we have to have folks physically come and spell it out. And I think it's important that the distinctions need to be made. Some of us are literally, we saw the diagram that Shelley shared. Some of us are seeing that really spelled out for the first time, but then think that you're going to have a completely different group that may not include any of us in Ways and Means. It's a little subgroup. They're going to be listening, and if they don't understand the distinction, they're not going to understand it's apples and pomegranates, and I mean, it's going to be completely different. And they really need to understand that distinction. And, judiciary can do what they want to do with it, but your ask is to address the specific needs of the groups that you represent. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And legislators, you've been through that process, so share if there's anything else that we're missing, but we need to know what the potential pitfalls might be if certain things aren't spelled out. Otherwise, they're going to say, well, they didn't include it in the language of the bill. We don't know that it's going to be, and it's going to be bastardized in the rules and regs process. And sometimes it's just a matter of control because, then that money just comes right back.
Yeah.
So, yes, Representative Heiberger.
One comment. I guess I'm not sure of any administrative regulation that would have been subject to the constitutional amendment that talks about agencies dividing their budget allocations, but if there's some out there, I'd like to see them. But
Anyone else? I'm sorry. Yes, Representative Resman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would it help to try to uniform some of the correction committees as they work across the state? Because you mentioned Johnson County does one thing and another county does another. Is there anything that we could do to unify it on any level?
I would prefer, in my opinion, to leave that up to the advisory boards and the county commissions. I think that they do a good job of treating things differently for their own agencies, just as if it's two combined, the needs of Western Kansas are going to get lost in the needs of Sedgwick County and Johnson County, just like the things that Johnson County and Sedgwick County need could get lost if we're combining too many of those groups together.
Let's go through again the ask so that we fully understand the ask.
Correct.
So the $6 million in operations, that's above and beyond.
Correct. This would be 11.5 additional $1 million. 4.5 for increased staff, 1 million for behavioral health.
So talk about the behavioral health, please. And here's why. Because you indicated that the slide prior that was just on behavioral health, it's been at 3 million since 2014. So no costs in behavioral health have ever gone up in, 8 years, and it's going to be 9 years in 2 months. So talk to us about how you came up with 1 million and what that increase is going to mean statewide, because quite frankly, $4 million statewide seems very small to me.
It's not enough. It's not enough. When we look back, when this grant first started in FY14, this was great. For an agency like Reno County, we've never had the money to help a client pay for a substance abuse evaluation, to pay for anything, for mental health medications, for mental health copay. We've never had the money to do that. We've always been underfunded to the point where we could barely survive. So when this grant came, this was a game changer for Reno County. And I think it had a significant impact across the state, because what we're then able to do is, for us now, we're helping pay for mental health medications. We're helping pay for co-pays. We're paying for substance abuse evaluation. So when you think about a client that gets assigned to our program, maybe they're fresh out of jail, they don't have a job, they don't have a place to stay. If we can pay for this substance abuse evaluation, rather than saying, well, we'll wait a month and a half until you actually have a job and a place to stay and you can afford an assessment, we're paying for that up front. We're going to try to get services started as quick as we can. And same thing with mental health. If we don't address some of these mental health needs, they're not going to be able to afford them, or they're not going to be able to prioritize that money within their own budget.
So is the mental health assessment going to be done by the CMHC?
Correct. A lot of times it's not an assessment we're paying for with mental health, just because of the way that's set up. It's usually co-pays, like on a sliding fee scale, or it's mental health medications. We have people that get out of jail that they don't have enough medications to go to treatment, and the treatment provider for an inpatient treatment, they won't take them if the person doesn't have the mental health meds to enter the inpatient bed. So there's no one to pay for that. And so this has been very beneficial for us to be able to do that.
And I see it's beneficial, but the reason I want to circle back around is it's been at $3 million for 8 years, and you're asking for $1 million more. So are we still just scratching the surface? What, if we were to say, what does it cost? What would you need statewide for this to be effective? What would the cost really be?
I think $6 million is a great place to start. Doubling that. Again, this has been a lot of years. We've seen a lot of inflation over this last few years. Agencies can use their other grant dollars to pay for that, to pay for behavioral health services. But like I said, most of those agencies don't have the money within their grant budget for supervision to pay for those extra services. So this grant is pretty specific. It's very focused on behavioral health, but we could easily double that. It would be in a much better position.
I do think that your association needs to look at what they've done this fiscal year so far. Should be able to predict the remainder, but look at what you have done and what the actual demand is. Because what we have heard so far, and we really haven't gotten heavy into the numbers as far as corrections, right? So not knowing the numbers, but what we have heard is now that COVID's kind of lessened up, we're starting to see spike in criminal behavior. I assume that we're going to continue, as long as we have that recession issue, we'll continue to see spikes or increases in that. So anticipate that and use real data.
Okay.
So say to us, for this fiscal year, this is how many folks we had, and this was the unmet need. That's what we need to hear. So, as legislators, we need to know, what is it really going to cost? And we may not be able to provide or sustain that, because every agency is going to come in and say, I mean, they're going to be doubling their travel expenditure because now it's not COVID and they're traveling, but also fuel is so expensive. So we know increased costs are coming in, but here is an issue. We are dumping money into mental health for K through 12 like no tomorrow. We're trying to get our foster kids at least assessed so they can start to receive the services. But if we don't know what you're doing at your level, and your funding pathway is very different from everybody else that's coming to the state for funding. So as you prepare for session, and even if you can before the end of day Wednesday, get us some new ballpark numbers, but then tighten that up for session.
Okay.
So that it's real and it's backed up with, and legislators love to see a map. And we want to see, and I know that we have different areas where, you know, the drug issue, drug rehab is very serious, very serious. But unless we're really doing something more to feed and to keep them out of prison, because we do know that's the most expensive option every step of the way. Clogs up the courts, clogs up every part of the process. But I think we need to have a better, more accurate picture. But start with making sure every group that you talk to, they understand your funding is different. And these are the needs, and make sure that they also understand, for some, it isn't the pay increase, got to have more manpower. And that does get me to my next question. If some of those counties had been able to keep the funding, still, I'm going to be surprised if we find language that limited it. But do you have actual manpower out there to hire? What's the requirements for hiring? Would someone graduating from high school or looking for a new career be eligible to use the Kansas Promise Scholarship to get the background training to become an employee?
Typically, we require a bachelor's degree in a social services field. That's what we're looking for. We just hired someone that's going to graduate from Sterling College in December. So I think the people are out there, but it is a difficult labor market.
Everybody's, yeah,
Yeah,
everybody's, and you're also competing against sign-up bonuses.
correct.
Okay. All right. Senator Fascadeau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So some of your line of questioning made me want to get good clarification on what we call Senate Bill 123, a rehabilitation as opposed to incarceration. So, however, the funding that you're asking for would be for behavioral and mental services and pay increases for guards. So I guess I'm trying to see if, in fact, there could be a crossover to whereas funding, and Madam Chair, I don't know if Randy here can answer this question, but I used to think I knew what Senate Bill 123 of how those in our communities who need their services of how they could access those services from that law. However, so you're released from prison, do you have to pay for that services, or there's fundings there for one to utilize those services? And then, Madam Chair, Randy, could that funding for Senate Bill 123 somehow coincide to help what you're doing or not? Thank you.
Sure. So if you're sentenced under Senate Bill 123, your substance abuse treatment services are going to be paid for 18 months starting the date of your first treatment. So that's going to be paid for. It will not cover your mental health. It won't cover mental health meds. It won't cover, I don't believe it'll cover substance abuse medications. There are a few of those out there that we utilize. So some of those do not cross over. So that behavioral health fund is going to pay for the people that are not sentenced under Senate Bill 123. When we look at just Reno County alone, about 75% of the cases assigned to us are specifically for a drug offense. So maybe half of that 75% are Senate Bill 123, the other half are drug sales, distribution, manufacture cases. So those people all need substance abuse treatment, but that's not going to get paid for under Senate Bill 123. So this is where those additional treatment dollars are going to come into play.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course, the reason I wasn't here this morning is because, this afternoon, we're going to be making a decision on whether to build, a new mental health hospital in Wichita. And I think we probably do need to build that facility, but this is an example of if we can, and I'm not saying, I want to see the data and everything before we, but if we double that, that is going to impact whether or not more individuals end up in that hospital, which will then impact whether or not we need to build another one later on. So if we can get to individuals early on, like in something like this, I think the problem is too many times these sort of grants kind of just they're out there, but those of us in the legislature, we don't necessarily know what they're doing or the impact and things like that. So I totally agree with the chairwoman. The more that appropriations and Ways and Means can know about this sort of thing, I think the better chance you have to getting increased funding, because it impacts all the way down. I mean, you can catch people and they stay on their meds, they stay connected. They're not going to end up then either in our current correctional facility or in our mental health hospitals. So I appreciate you bringing this up.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very costly, in all honesty, to provide those services in the community. When we look at some of our individuals that we supervise, there's people that currently in Reno County were paying for their housing because we know that when a person's homeless, that's going to increase the chances that they're going to use substances, and it's going to decrease the chances that they're going to receive mental health treatment. I'll be honest, it's not going to happen if they're homeless. And so we're having to work on a whole spectrum of things that we're going to provide to an individual to keep them on the right path. So there is going to be the needs for the mental health beds because those really high needs people. But there's a lot of those people that we can provide services to out in the community. And the one thing I will say is there are individuals that when we look at a revocation rate, I would not look at that all negatively. I wouldn't say we should search for a 100% success rate. We supervise dangerous people in the community. We supervise people that are going to continue to batter people. So those are people that we do need to revoke to prison. But a lot of those people, if we can provide them the services in the community, we can prevent the more costly prison bed.
Natalie.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I heard back from our budget revisers relating to the question of whether there was a proviso in that budget language, and there was no proviso. So the appropriation line item was given. There was some supporting documentation in the governor's budget amendment that said the purpose of the money was for the 5% pay increase, but there's no proviso language in the budget itself that would restrict that money.
Explain that again about the governor's memo.
So I think probably that during the budget process, when that money was requested, there was information given to you as to why it was requested, and the purpose that was stated was that it was for this 5% pay increase, but there's no proviso in the budget language itself.
Go ahead. Representative Hoffman.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So, yeah, there probably was talk that this would help bring that 5% up, but it never was put in there that it can only be used for that. It was just the reason why. I think the governor put it in her budget, didn't she? It was part of her budget, yeah. So that was probably her rationale for doing it, but yet there was nothing we ever said that had to be used for that.
So I guess if we could, can you give us some clarification with regard to, so they were required to send the money back?
That would fall under unexpended funds at the end of our fiscal year. We were not able to expend those funds, and so those technically are rolled back to the Department of Corrections at the end of a fiscal year.
So that is a status quo process.
Correct. If we can't use all of our grant funds at the end of a fiscal year, it's basically reduced from the next grant cycle, which would be basically sending that back to the state.
So that's an agency policy?
I believe that's the Department of Corrections, how that structure works.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yes, Representative Carlin and then Representative Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just was hearing
this on my way in the building, and it sometimes went off, but I understood that, I was reminded that the governor's budget included money for the last part of '22. Is that the money that we're discussing now that was sent back? Because when a GBA occurs, I don't know that, I mean, I don't understand why we're asking about a proviso, because provisos are there if we're only going to do it 1 year. So there's no proviso. It sounds to me like that's a good thing for the future. But are you talking about part of the money that was for '22 that you had to send back because it came late?
We had to send it back because agencies were not restricted from using it. So that was a $2.6 million for FY23. But for Johnson County specifically, they're not going to be able to use any of the $9.2 million for FY23 because of the same conditions, that they could only be used for salary increases. And since their wages were already at the level that was restricted as the top level, they were not able to use that.
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Owens.
Thank you. So just to clarify, it appears that this was a decision made by someone within Kansas Department of Corrections, whether that was unilaterally made by them or at the direction of the governor's office. Am I understanding that correct, the usage of these funds?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Okay, so I know we have Randy here with KDOC, and I know KDOC is going to be presenting at some point in the next day or two. Randy, would you make sure that we get some understanding of where that decision was made? Thank you.
Committee, any other questions? I so appreciate you being here. Thank you for your willingness to withstand our confusion and clarifying. And that's why the PowerPoints and the information that you share with us as experts in the field is so important to us. And we're going to just keep asking questions until we get what we feel is a grasp of. We'll springboard. Please pay attention to the next couple of days, because I think we'll be working towards some type of solution for this current fiscal year. But also, I think you have some more information to help you prepare for that budget process. And again, don't try and do it yourself. You have people in every county that can help you, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so we certainly look forward to that. And I do know one thing. We have a lot of representation from a lot of different counties. Urge your folks to reach out to their House and Senate members and say, this is how in our county we're impacted by this. This is what we think we could do with that, because we want all legislators to be able to have that ownership. It's a statewide issue, but it's also a local issue, and we all have to be working toward that. So Thank you so much. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. We're happy to come testify whenever you'd like to hear from us.
Committee, it's time for us to gather our things up, throw away our trash, and work our way over to the Shawnee County Community Corrections Office. You've got your map. Decide if you're walking or carpooling or driving yourself. But it does start promptly in 23 minutes. So get yourselves over there.